If you have a Testament, please come back. That portion of scripture we read. Joshua chapter 2. Then Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim. Go look over the land, he said, especially Jericho. So they went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. The king of Jericho was told, look, some of the Israelites have come here tonight to spy out the land. Friends, the opening verses of Joshua chapter 2 record one of Joshua's most practical and one of his most prudent decisions prior to leading the nation of Israel into the promised land. As the people of God were preparing to cross the river Jordan, they had already received a number of impressive promises. Promises from God which guaranteed their success. As a nation, they were ready to move. They were ready to face their enemies. They were ready to change places and take the land which lay before them for themselves. But before they did any of that, Joshua chose 2 men and sent them as spies into Canaan. Now, at first glance, it would seem that decision was wrong and that Joshua was acting a bit out of character. God had already told him, be strong and courageous. Do not be terrified. Do not be dismayed. That none would be able to stand against him. Joshua chapter 1 verse 5. So why then, given all those promises and given all those assurances, did Joshua need to send out 2 spies? Why did he not simply take God at his word and lead the nation forward in faith? Why did he feel that he had to take this step of first of all surveying the land? Those types of queries have led some to say that Joshua didn't fully trust God and that his heart was now wavering. But Joshua here, please, was not querying God's path or questioning God's will. You see, his desire and decision to send out the 2 spies was not so much a decision that doubted God. Rather, it was a decision designed to encourage God's people, the nation of Israel. This action on Joshua's part wasn't a sign of weak faith, please. It was wise faith. It was wise faith. Joshua knew that by sending out these 2 spies and those spies reporting back, that the people would be confident to go through with what God had already declared. This decision to send the spies was in order to assure the people that the way was open to them and that they could take the land for themselves. Rather than lacking faith, Joshua was acting as someone with great wisdom. You see, God doesn't call us to abandon all sense when it comes to following him, does he? We are not to throw, friends, caution to the wind by being insensible in our actions. Yes, of course, we are to obey the Lord. Yes, of course, we are to go through with the Lord. But we are also to exercise wisdom and care as we do so. We may recall the cloudy pillar and the fiery pillar that directed the Israelites through the wilderness. That was a token of God's presence with them. And yet we also discover that as the people journeyed through the wilderness, they sent forward spies. They sent scouts forward to see where they could camp, to see where they could settle for the night. So even though God was with them and God was guiding them, the nation of Israel still exercised wisdom as they followed the Lord. Therefore, Joshua was right in sending out these spies. Now, when we look, please, at these 2 men, there are certain things that stand out about them in verse 1 and 2. They were to look over the land, look verse 1 if you're following. They were, in the Authorized Version, to view the land. And in verse 2, the reference there is to spy out the land. In other words, to search out the country. These men were to search silently. They were to view the land. They were to look over the land. They were to go through the land of Canaan, examining the situation, paying particular attention to that area around Jericho. They were to observe what was happening and bring back information about the places and people of that country. These two spies were to uncover details and particulars and then return and report those things back to Joshua. He, Joshua, in turn, would use that information to encourage the nation of Israel to go on and to go forward with God. Notice, if you follow in verse 2, these two spies came to Jericho by night. Look. Why is that important? Well, it's important because it reveals that they were not careless men. Had they come in the middle of the day, their presence would have been known immediately, and they would have been arrested at once. These men exercised caution. They exercised care as they performed their duty. As they served the Lord under Joshua, these men were not reckless, I want to suggest. But they were also determined. To be an Israelite spy in Jericho at this time was a highly dangerous occupation. Detection would mean certain torture and death. Espionage, even today, is a risky business, isn't it? When these two men learned that the king of Jericho was aware of their coming, they did not turn back from their work. They continued steadfast, determined to carry out the duty that was placed upon them, even though they were in the greatest possible danger. Why did these two men go to a house of a prostitute? Now, friends, we must be clear. There was nothing impure about their motives here. It was simply a place where they could go, where they could enter and find information about the city. And therefore, these two men acted as wisely as serpents in this particular work. Christian brother, Christian sister, when we think of our duty going forward as a church or in our personal witness for the Lord, yes, we too are to be strong and courageous, steadfast and determined. But we must also be discerning in our service for God, that it is in fact God who is calling us and giving us a work to do. We must be careful, we must be discerning that it is in fact God who is calling us and giving us a particular work to do. These men were determined, they were diligent, they were discerning. But as they searched that city, as they talked with Rahab, as they moved through the streets, keeping one step ahead of the authorities, what did these men discover and learn in Jericho which would really encourage the hearts of the children of Israel? What did they discover and learn? Well, they discovered that God was at work. That's what they discovered. Even in the midst of heathen darkness, God was at work. You see, by all accounts, the city of Jericho was an oasis of beauty, pleasure, and affluence. In the days of Joshua, this particular city was known as a city of palm trees. Some commentators suggest that you could smell the palm trees from quite a distance. It had a reputation as a city of great wealth and vast riches. Therefore, Jericho was the envy of other cities. It had security, it had prosperity, it had stability, and yet none of those natural and social qualities could disguise the fact that Jericho was a godless and sin-laden place. In Deuteronomy chapter 9 verse 4 to 5, when God spoke of the wickedness of these places, he was speaking of Canaan in general. But that description, the wickedness of these places, was also true of Jericho in particular. For many in that city were given over to idols. There was very little knowledge of the true God. There was a desire in that place for the pleasures and sins of that age. And added to that was many in Jericho lived only for the present time without any thought of eternity. Jericho was not a godly city. It was a city full of sin and a city full of bold and stubborn sinners. And because of those things, it was a city under the condemnation and judgment of God. Jericho was a city on the verge of being destroyed, and the wrath of God was stacked against it. It was a dark, pagan, godless, sin-filled centre within days of being judged for its own iniquity. And therefore, friends, from a human point of view, it was the most unlikely place to find God working in mercy. Here is a city full of wickedness, and within days of being judged for that wickedness. And yet, those two spies discovered in the midst of that wickedness and in the shadow of that wrath, they discovered and learned that God was working in mercy. Isn't that an encouragement to us? Isn't that an encouragement to us as we look around at our land, that God is still working in mercy? Just as these men searched, spied, viewed, observed, and as we do the same today, as we search and survey, as we look around our towns and our cities and our communities, as we consider the way God would have us to go, surely there's encouragement for us to go on and to go through with God. When these two men managed to get through the gates of Jericho, they were providentially directed to the house of Rahab. Rahab was known as a harlot, a prostitute. She had a very infamous background. Her past was full of very dark and depraved secrets. Some commentators try to lessen the impact of the word harlot by suggesting that the term could be that of an innkeeper or a hostess. There's a nonsense in it. No, Rahab had a wicked and a sinful history. But as these two men talked with her, it became very clear to them that God had been working in her heart. Isn't that wonderful? Verses 4 to 13, look if you're following. But the woman had taken the two men and hidden them. She said, she's now speaking to the soldiers, "Yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they had come from. At dusk, when it was time to close the city gate, the men left. I don't know which way they went. Go after them quickly," she says. "You may catch them." But she had taken them up to the roof and hidden them under the stalks of flax she had laid out on the roof. Verse 7, so the men set out in pursuit of the spies on the road that leads to the fords of the Jordan. And as soon as the pursuers had gone out, the gate was shut. Before the spies lay down for the night, she went up on the roof and said to them, "I know that the Lord has given this land to you, and a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that those who live in this country are melting in fear because of you." Verse 10, if you're following. "We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, And what you did to Sihon and Og, the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. Verse 12, now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family, because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and that you will save us from death. Let's not forget, please, these are the words of a harlot. What an amazing statement. Rahab could have turned those two spies in. She could have exposed them as spies and as enemies. She could have had them put to death. But there was an altogether different principle now working in Rahab's heart. She identified with these men, and as she talked with them, it was becoming very obvious that she had faith in God. Right there, in that pagan, perverse and sinful city, God had moved in this woman's heart, and it was obvious that God had revealed certain things to her. Verse 9, Rahab understood that there was one true God. I know that the Lord has given you the land. He was a woman more accustomed to idolatry. And yet she says, I know that the Lord. She doesn't say your God or this God among many gods. Rahab identifies the Lord as the Lord. She understood that God had power over all things, verse 10. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea. And we must remember that had happened some 40 years earlier. Yet the report of God drying up the Red Sea had reached Jericho. And Rahab believed that report. And she believed that God had performed that miracle. She understood that God had power over all things. She understood that God was able and mighty to destroy his enemies. She speaks in verse 10b, reading from the Authorized Version, whom he utterly destroyed. She also understood the need to be saved from God's wrath. That's why she asks in verse 12 and 13, now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will spare the lives of my father, mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, that you will save us from death. Who would have thought that such a thing was happening? Who would have thought that such a thing was happening in Jericho, of all places, and that God was moving? As they listened to this woman, what a lesson that must have been for these two spies, that God was not limited by boundaries, walls, and borders. That God was able to work in the heart of this pagan girl and turn her heart from sin to serve him. God was at work, even in the hardest place. That's what these spies learned and discovered in Jericho. And as we think on that then, as we look at the Garw Valley, Llangaina, Bridgend, shouldn't that truth encourage us? Encourage our hearts? God is at work even in the hardest of places. Wonderful, isn't it? I don't know what the hardest street up in Llangaina is or what the Garw Valley is, but I'm sure there's a few. There is in Kevin Cribbo, as there is in Kenfig and Pyle, etc. You know what I mean? God is at work, even in the hardest of places. In Job chapter 23, verse 9, we read these words in the Authorized Version. On the left hand, where he doth work, but I cannot behold him. He hideth himself on the right hand, that I cannot see him. Job in that verse, friends, is speaking about the Lord, and he says on the left hand where he doth work. God works on the left hand. The left hand, let's be honest, is often viewed as being the most inconvenient side, isn't it? Any left-handers here? I'm the only one. Oh, well done, Gary. The left hand, you see, friends, is often viewed as being the most inconvenient side, the most difficult place, the awkward position. That's how it's viewed, isn't it? The left side. Yet he, God, works on the left hand, this awkward, inconvenient position. And what Job is emphasizing is that God is able to work and does work and continues to work even in the most difficult situations. We mustn't lose sight that God is able to work in the hearts and minds of the vilest of sinners. And that, in fact, is the testament of Scripture. God worked in Ur of the Chaldeans and saved Abraham, who was an idolater, and made him to be the father of the faithful. God worked in Babylon and had mercy on Nebuchadnezzar. God worked at Calvary and saved the dying thief. God worked in the heart of a man who was seeking with all his power to destroy the church of Christ. He saved Saul of Tarsus. Can I ask you gently, has he worked in your life and saved you? God is not limited. God is not bound by borders, by districts, or by people's prejudice against him. He can and he does work in the most unlikely of places. Satan, you see, says to you and me, the day is too dark. The day is too hard. The hold of the world is too great. The devil's a liar. God is always at work. Always convicting, always challenging, always calling, always converting sinners to himself. If we would just stop, examine things and view things, survey things, we would discover, friends, that God is moving. Jericho was a darkened city spiritually, and yet God was at work. Those two spies, as they listened to Rahab, as they surveyed that place, they came to that conclusion: God here is still at work. Has God stopped working in Wales? No, he hasn't. No, he hasn't. Please, let's not get discouraged. Yes, we'd all like to see greater blessings outwardly, but God is still with us. With God, all things are possible, and his power can work as truly in the 21st century as it did in the opening of the 20th century. Psalm 2 verse 8, ask of me, and I shall give thee the heathen for thine inheritance. God's word will not fail. God's plan will not be forsaken. God's purpose will not be forgotten. God will ensure his church is victorious. Even in the midst of troubled times, please, we are assured of the triumph of the gospel. Christ's promise to build his church will not be thwarted. Let us then please persevere in our work, in our witness, and encourage ourselves, encourage each other in the Lord as we seek to serve him in whatever capacity that may be. For his name's sake. Amen.